Record. All right, so we are looking tonight at the Gospel of John, chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. And the Gospel according to John is our fourth Gospel. It comes kind of the final in the canonical line. And this one is a very interesting one. It kind of parallels the original synoptic gospels, those first three that come before it. There are similar stories that happen, but it's a much different one, both in the kind of narrative path that it takes and in the theological path that it takes. There's a bit of a paradox within it that the Jewish scholars in the Jewish annotated New Testament commentary kind of like to point out, is that while John makes abundant use of the Hebrew Bible through direct quotations and allusions, and even more subtly too, and kind of appropriates the culture as well into the ways of being expressed in the gospel, there's at the same time a very disturbing kind of representation of the Jewish people. In the Gospel of John, the Jewish people are very often represented as Jesus's quote-unquote arch enemies, kind of being blind to the truth and very hostile in some cases, which is probably a much more literary embellishment than actual realistic, because back in those days, with all of the kind of what am I trying to say? With all of the diversity that was present in just Judaism alone, theologically, ethnically, culturally, it wasn't necessarily guaranteed that to follow Jesus was something that was going to be met with hostility from the Jewish people. So that's something of note, I think, that to look at in the gospel. But it raises some issues. It raises quite a bit of issue because of the way that people read the text. We can read in and read out whatever we choose. And so the way that the Jewish people are portrayed in the Gospel of John is often kind of leads to historic and modern anti-Semitism from modern and historical Christians as well, which I mean, we've kind of got some famous examples of how anti-Semitism can wreak havoc on that population. The anti-Semitism that's kind of present in the gospel, though, isn't necessarily an ethnic or racial anti-Semitism. It's a much more theological and ritual prejudice, in that they're doing things very differently. They believe certain things that are just wrong. In John 8:44, Jesus declares to the Jewish audience, "You are from your father, the devil, and you choose to do your father's desires," which is a very condemnatory statement from Jesus. And this kind of accusation is taken very literally by many and contributes further to that anti-Semitism. And that's been a very damaging thing for quite a bit of history. The explanation for some people is that the difficult rhetoric that's presented can be understood as part of the authoring group and the community that's known among scholarly groups as the Johannine community. It's kind of wondering, they're kind of assuming that it's a rhetorical strategy to kind of help them distinguish themselves from other people, and distinguish themselves theologically, and kind of make a name for themselves within the rest of the world. So while it's very problematic and it shouldn't be dismissed. That is a thought as to why it is so very strong in its anti-Semitic language and its anti-Semitic representations. The gospel historically is thought to be written and completed right around 85 to 95 CE. The earliest fragments of the gospel that are known by scholars are known from the Rylands Library papyrus, which was dated back to 135, between 135 and 160. And kind of because circulation of the gospel from Asia Minor, which is where it was likely written, and then to Egypt, where these scrolls, these papyrus pieces were found, would have taken a few decades. Scholars kind of estimate that it was probably written and completed around 85 to 95 CE. There's a lot of evidence for a very lengthy process of compilation and composition because of there are some narrative inconsistencies, particularly in chapter 6, verse 1. Jesus kind of abruptly ends up on the other side of Galilee, on the other side of the Sea of Galilee. He had, in just the previous chapter, he was in Jerusalem, and now he's kind of miles and miles away. So there's gaps that need to be filled in. And then in chapter 14, verse 31, Jesus says, "Rise, let us be on our way," and then continues to speak from that starting point for another 3 chapters. So it's interesting that that monologue kind of starts and then doesn't seem to stop for another 3 chapters. There's also another interesting thing is this gospel contains one passage that didn't necessarily originally belong. In chapter 7, verse 53 through 8:13, there's the story of the woman caught in adultery. And in some manuscripts, it finds itself in Luke 21:38, where that one, in that story, it fits much better as far as the narrative storyline goes along. And there's also been questions raised about chapter 21, kind of on the grounds of both the content and the style. Some scholars kind of believe that this final chapter is a later addition, which is not uncommon for most texts and most of our scripture texts to have things added in, whether right in the middle or right on the end at a later date to kind of complement the story. It's also believed that the audience of this gospel, the Johannine community, as it's known, is a very diverse audience. And while it's predominantly it's very interesting in that it's made up by some Jewish people, but also some Gentile people, and it's a pretty diverse community, which is also kind of interesting to see how negative the gospel is with the Jewish people, while also drawing from their history and kind of moving forward from that place and distinguishing themselves so intensely from it. The intended audience for this gospel, it would have included Jews, Gentiles, and Samaritans. So they really kind of needed to create their own identity for them to be able to be proud of and unite around, because of the traditional differences that those groups kind of have with them. So that's kind of what I've got. If you want to read more, I would really highly recommend purchasing the Jewish Annotated New Testament and reading through it. It's got kind of commentary at the beginning talking about the historicity of each passage, as well as commentary as it goes along, referencing the Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures that are kind of being referenced in each New Testament passage. So it's a really great tool for really in-depth scripture study. So with all that being said, I'm going to dive into the lesson if I can find it. It's amazing how in this gigantic book that I'm holding that such a small section of it is actually even the New Testament. We've got from basically, like, it's a book this thick, but where's Matthew? The New Testament is only this much of the book, and it's just fascinating to me. It's one of those weird kind of nerd moments for me that I like to just marvel over. So chapter 2, verses 1 through 11, and it reads, 3 days later, there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee, and Mary, the mother of Jesus, was there. Jesus and his disciples had likewise been invited to the celebration. And at a certain point, the wine ran out, and Jesus' mother told him, "They have no wine." Jesus replied, "Mother, what's this got to do with me? My hour has not yet come." But she instructed those waiting on tables, "Do whatever he tells you." As prescribed for Jewish ceremonial washings, there were 6 stone water jars on hand, each one holding between 15 and 25 gallons. Jesus said, "Fill those jars with water," and the servers filled them to the brim. "Now," said Jesus, "draw some out and take it to the caterer." And they did as they were instructed. The caterer tasted the water, which had been turned into wine, without knowing where it had come from. The only ones who knew were those who were waiting on the tables, since they had drawn the water. The caterer called the bride and groom over and remarked, "People usually serve the best wine first. Then, when the guests have been drinking a while, a lesser vintage is served. What you've done is to keep the best wine until now." Jesus performed this, the first of his signs, at Cana in Galilee. In this way, he revealed his glory, and the disciples believed in him. So one of the interesting things that I find kind of pops up for me in this gospel is the attention to the needs of others, and who's paying attention and who kind of isn't. Mary seems to be the one that's uniquely paying attention to the needs of the people at the wedding, while Jesus kind of has a little angsty teenager moment. We know he's well into his 30s at this point, but he kind of has a weird, edgy moment where he's like, "Mom, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." So it almost seems like Jesus is a little bit inconvenienced by this. And of note, whenever Jesus performs miracles in the Gospel of John, he tends to be hesitant to do them. It's one of his things where he's very much of the opinion that you should believe regardless of all of these great and shiny miracles that I'm performing. They shouldn't be the basis of your faith. So Jesus tends to be very hesitant to do any sort of signs in the Gospel of John, for that fear that people will kind of be drawn to the miracle rather than the message. And so Jesus is kind of a little bit inconvenienced by this because it doesn't go along with his plan necessarily. He mentions, my hour has not yet come. But Jesus does it anyways. Jesus kind of takes the plan and puts it aside for a moment and meets the needs of the people, meets those immediate needs that are there. And that is kind of one of the really meaty parts of this text for me, is that Jesus is taking, this plan and putting it aside and really putting people first. And that's ultimately how I think the first, this being the first of his miracles, there's something to that the human needs are being met before any of these what's called eschatological needs. And eschatology is the study of salvation. It's a big seminary word that I like to use, so I figured I'd share it with you tonight. So Jesus in John is very focused on the transcendent theological points that he makes, and there's various other portions of the gospel that point to Jesus being a much more transcendent figure than in some of the other gospels. But this first miracle was performed in a very basic way. The morning group this morning kind of talked about how they felt it was very weird that of all the things he could have done, this was his first miracle. And we kind of discussed why that was, but this first miracle really tended to hospitality, tended to human need, rather than spiritual need first. So that's kind of what I've got right now. So we can open up the